Creativity comes in a lot of different forms. You can get inspired by what surrounds you, the nature you live in or that you maybe feel drawn to. You can get inspired by history, by different eras with their distinctive art, fashion and culture. Or you can get inspired by people around you, by friends that you meet on your creative journey that challenge you and support you in growing your art. How fortunate that this project is inspired by all three of those. So this video today is one of the few where I'm going to make a dress for someone else. And this means it won't start like the usual video, you know, where I'm drawing a sketch and then directly start to sew it. Because with projects like this, where you sew for a client or for a collaboration like this, there is a lot more work involved before the actual sewing and also somehow before the design process, because you have to agree on a theme, you have to be inspired by the same thing, and you also have to find out if you think about the same thing. Because, for example, you can be inspired by the same thing, but the inspiration can take you both in total different directions. So this video is going to be a collaboration with Queen Astraea. You probably know her from her hilarious and beautiful TikToks, but she's also on Instagram and YouTube, and you should definitely check her out there because you may see the dress we're working on today in person. Something that brought us together was our love for historical inspired dresses, so we definitely had a starting point from where we could take off with our ideas. Astraea had two suggestions. One was a Tudor inspired dress and the other one was a 1860s ball gown inspired dress. And let's be honest, who wouldn't want to sew an 1860s inspired ball gown if they had the chance for it? So we settled on this idea pretty quickly. Another thing Astraea suggested was to make the dress stars inspired and especially inspired by the North Star, given the origin of her name and her personal connection to it. And I always love to incorporate personal things into dresses that means something to the person that's going to wear it, because I think that brings the whole thing to another level and makes the dress even more special and personal. And also you maybe know that I love to make dresses inspired by the night sky, so this ticked another box for me and we pretty quickly agreed on this theme for the dress. This means I could directly move on to the next step and start draw up some designs. We chose this dress as the inspiration for the shape and especially for the skirt, so I could start with this as the base and then move on from that. I always love a more realistic approach to inspiration, so this is what I went for with this dress as well. Since our main focus was the North Star, I thought I could play a bit more subtle with it and instead of adding it to the dress, make the person that wears the dress the North Star. I wanted to do it by adding the whole northern hemisphere on the skirt of the dress, which would mean that the North Star would be in the center where obviously later the waist will be. So this means when Astraea is wearing the dress, she will have the whole northern hemisphere around her and will be at the point where the North Star would sit. For this I wanted to mimic one of those star charts around her and I wanted it to be as accurate as possible. With the skirt done, I wanted to add some shooting stars to the top of the dress so that it would complement the skirt nicely. So now the design is ready, and instead of just starting to sew, now the next step is to send it to the person you're making the dress for and discussing with them what they like about the design, what they don't like, what they feel wouldn't work for them, or maybe what they really like about it and what they want to keep at all costs. So that was the next step. I sent the design to Astraea and she really loved it. The only thing we decided to change was the color of the dress to match her complexion better, so we settled on a lighter, more silvery kind of blue. To make sure the skirt would have enough depth to it, we decided to add a gradient to the skirt. This means we start with a darker tone at the bottom and the skirt will turn lighter towards the top, so that at the point where the skirt meets the bodice, they would both have the same lighter color. That means this is now the finished design and I really couldn't wait to start to sew it. Now that we've got the design settled, I want to talk about the sponsor of today's video, Craftsy. Craftsy is an online community with over 2,000 classes spanning everything creative from sewing, quilting or knitting to painting and cooking, for example. With every project I'm working on, and with this one as well, there are techniques or crafts that I have to learn or maybe refresh a little bit, and that's something I hugely enjoy. So having a platform where you can directly learn from experts with courses spanning every skill level sparks creativity for me. When starting a project like this one, for example, I can search Craftsy beforehand for every topic that might come up in the process. I directly looked into this article, Top 10 Tips for Sewing with Silk, and also really enjoyed this dressmaking techniques course. I hope I'll have some time in the future to check out some not sewing related courses as well. Which craft do you want to get into next? The first 1,000 subscribers to click the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49. That's a huge discount compared to the normal price at $123. Please understand that the offer is only valid for new members. Thank you Craftsy for sponsoring today's video, and now let's start with the sewing. With projects this big, the first thing I do is to gather all the materials I need to check if I got everything or if I maybe almost ran out of something and needed to order it again. Since this is such a big project, I divided it into 2 parts, the skirt and petticoat being part 1 and the bodice and lining part 2. So I started with putting all the materials for the skirts on the cutting table. For this project I got a black sturdy petticoat fabric as well as some rest pieces from a white petticoat fabric. This, together with some boning and reinforcement, will become the base of the petticoat. The 4 different tulle fabrics will become the underskirt that will have the color gradient in it. I ordered 25 meters from the darkest and lightest blue and had 10 meters from the other blue, as well as some rest pieces of white tulle. The outer skirt will be made from a silk chiffon, embellished with a lot of glass beads to make up the star pattern. From this fabric I got 10 meters as well. Then I made sure that I had the right matching threads for every fabric color that was laying on the cutting table, and with that had all the materials that I could start to work on the skirts. The first thing I made was some type of crinoline to put under the dress. I wanted to use a mixture of this together with the tulle underskirt so I could reduce some weight and also size, keeping in mind I had to send it around the world after the dress would be finished. But I didn't want to just use a crinoline because they are often visible from the outside and the skirt should look as smooth as possible. With the measurements from the test piece, I created a pattern and then cut out front and back pieces from the black petticoat fabric. I had to make sure that the crinoline wouldn't turn out too wide, since I would add a lot of tulle layers onto it. So I pinned and shaped it until it had the right measurements. After I was satisfied with the size, I could start reinforcing the crinoline with boning. Here I tried to take the specific shape of the 1860s skirts into consideration and reinforced the back a bit more to get the right angles here. In order to create the right shape for the skirt, it had to be steeper in the front and longer in the back. After that, I worked on the base layers for the tulle skirt. Since the skirt will change the color and get lighter towards the top, I divided the petticoat in a darker base layer and a lighter top layer, so that the base already accommodates the color change. With this base and the crinoline done, I could then sketch out the placement for all the tulle layers. The difficulty here was to accommodate the change in length from front and back, but also to keep in mind to plan the color change evenly. In the end, I decided on adding an extra layer at the back so that everything can match up in the end. Then it was time to start on the tulle. I worked my way up, starting with the darkest layers at the bottom. To get a feeling of the volume the tulle will add, I started with a few simple layers at the bottom, cut them in the right size, labeled them, and then sewed each layer, containing of a few tulle strips together. After each layer was a continuous strip, I then gathered them all at the top. When adding the layers on top of the base, I had a few set points where I knew the seams would go, for example, but otherwise I divided all the layers by eye. After pinning them all around the base in equal distances, I pulled the gathering threads tight, divided the fabric a bit more, and then sewed everything in place. I always like how small the first layers look, and the thought of how adding a lot of those layers will later create a huge skirt. With the first layer done, I could then repeat this for the few following layers. Seeing the skirt slowly taking shape and how every layer added gives the skirt more volume and color is something I really love. Sewing a skirt like this is a project where you can directly see progress, which feels very rewarding. Every layer gets longer since the distance to the hem gets wider, and so with every layer the cutting table or dress form looks fluffier. After sewing dark blue tulle for what felt like forever, I moved on to the lighter colors. Those will be added to the white petticoat fabric, so just like with the dark one, I had to draw in the lines for layers here as well. So, since I'm down here anyways, I thought I could give you a little update on how far we got. So we already got 4 layers of the dark blue tulle. Each layer contains 4 times 3 meters, which makes each layer 12 meters wide. So we have a total of 48 meters of the dark blue tulle right now. I think I will add some more because we want to achieve the gradient, so we have to make sure that the dark blue is also a bit more prominent on the last layers. So if I start to add the lighter tulle layers, as you can see here, and I would just continue with the lighter layers towards the top, you wouldn't see the dark blue in the end. So I think I will have to split up some layers in the end to make sure that the dark blue is still visible. So now you can see that I started to add the lighter petticoat fabric with the lighter tulle. We still have one even more lighter tulle for the last layers. So this is the mid-tone, I think. Something I really like is that you can already see the silhouette take shape, and that what I planned for it to look like seems to work out. I think one of the most difficult parts is to estimate how much volume the tulle will add to the construction. So I had to keep that in mind while constructing the petticoat crinoline layer, but you still don't quite know how it will turn out until you get there. So I'm really pleased with the first glances of it, and I will just continue to add to it. Now with the extra difficulty that I have to make sure that the colors will fade a little bit into each other. So I have to see how I can piece it together that it will fit the volume, fit the shape, and also fit the colors. So this was just a lot of time-consuming work, but mostly brainless, because I just had to gather fabric in the right length and add it to the skirt. But now with having to take the colors into consideration, it will get a little bit more difficult. And I'm really looking forward to it, because just gathering fabric and adding it to a tulle skirt is really not so fun. So now it gets a little bit more exciting, and I hope it will turn out as I imagined. So let's continue with the tulle skirt, I think. Here again I added layer after layer, this time alternating between shapes of the layers as well as the tulle colors. At this point I had sewn 2 layers for quite some time, so I used the surprisingly good weather to soak up some sun before continuing. From about the middle of the skirt I worked on each layer after another rather than preparing a few and then adding them all, so that I could see how each layer affected the shape and color of the skirt. This way I could build on that with every new layer and I could control the outcome best. At maybe 2/3 of the underskirt I slowly ran out of the middle tone tulle, so I had to fade it out as best as possible. This meant I was now mostly adding the lightest tulle over it using different densities and shapes of the layers. The underskirt got bigger and bigger, and with that I could add the final few layers onto it. Here I also switched from gathering it on the cutting table to gathering it on the mannequin, because now the base and the layers were sewn together in the center back and I couldn't lay it flat anymore. I just added the final layers onto it and now it's done. The next step would be now to add the actual skirt on top of it, but I thought we could just take a moment to appreciate this thing because it took me so long to make it and I want to show it off because I'm really happy with how it turned out. And I think the last thing I've actually explained were those layers on the bottom. Afterwards it got a bit more complex, so maybe we can explain it now a bit more. So after those darker layers I wanted to start the color change, and the difficulty with this kind of method is that you obviously only have limited colors, so you have to play with the opacity of the fabric to layer those colors on top of each other to create this faded effect. Since I used 3 different colors, like the dark blue, the middle tone and the grayish blue on top, I also added 1 layer of white all the way on the top to make it the lightest, but I still had to play with the transparencies of the fabric and layer them on top of each other to create this kind of faded effect. I still had to make sure that the bottom stayed completely dark, so even though I added lighter layers on top, I always had to cut off the bottom and add the dark blue there as well, so that the lighter fabrics on top of the dark blue wouldn't just make it lighter, of course. So this made it a lot more work because I couldn't just cut the layers and add them to the skirt, but I also had to divide those layers in different pieces, cut them from different fabrics, add them together, and I always had to make sure that the shape would match up, that the length would match, and that in the end I would get an even distribution of the colors. So that took a while. I ended up alternating layers that would go down to the bottom and just shorter ones that were always like 30 centimeters, 15 centimeters or 60 centimeters. I chose those kind of measurements to always have a similar ratio in general to make sure that it fades evenly. And I alternated those layers, like the shorter ones and the longer ones, to have the color change at the bottom and then build up the volume on top of it, because otherwise I would have had to do a lot of those split layers, which took up so much time. And I think this solution worked really well in the end and was the perfect mixture of not having to do an insane amount of work, getting the shape, getting the color. And so in the end it turned out really well, I think. I really love it. I really love the shape. I really love the volume the skirt has. I really love how it moves when you touch it. I loved working on it. I had so much fun, but at some point it's just too much, and I'm done now. I'm happy with it. And now let's continue with the silk chiffon. After sewing the underskirt, which felt like a whole project in itself, I put away what's left of the tulle for now and get out the silk chiffon. I really liked the colors of it with the light blue and subtle silver, and also loved how it looked on top of the petticoat. So next up I could start preparing the skirt panels. This was pretty easy. Before I had measured the length each panel needed to have to give the skirt the long back. So now I just had to cut the fabric the right length 5 times. These panels were then sewn together, leaving open the center back here as well for now. And then it was time to work on the star pattern for the skirt. Like I said earlier, I wanted to add an accurate star chart onto the skirt. So I traced one, making sure I drew over everything I wanted to add onto the skirt as well. Before, I had color-coded the different sizes of stars to have the variety on the skirt as well, so I could trace the stars with the right color depending on each size. This traced star chart was then projected onto a wall in my studio so that I could base the pattern onto the skirt panels. To do so, I had to change the circle of the chart into squares to accommodate the shape of the pattern, but since this was just annoying and time-consuming, I didn't film it. I had to do it this way because I wanted to gather the skirt at the top instead of using a circle skirt, so this extra step was necessary. I traced everything using thread the same color as the reference, so that adding the stars to the skirt would be fast later on. I worked through all 5 panels until everything was marked. The easiest thing to add were the circles of the chart itself, so I started with that. After that, I cleaned up the threads that were now unnecessary and started the lengthy process of adding all the stars to the skirt. For this, I set up a table in a separate room and slowly worked on it a little bit between every step of the bodice I had started at this point. This meant I wouldn't work on it for hours on end and it wouldn't tire me out so much. I brought the mock-up for the bodice to New York when we visited a few months ago to meet up with Astraea and to do the fitting there. So now, back home, I had all the changes I needed to do on the pattern to continue with the bodice. There were only a few quick changes to do, like shortening the waist a bit as well as tightening the bodice. So after transferring all the changes from the mock-up onto the pattern, I could already put said mock-up aside and start on the actual bodice. For this, I used a base made from 2 layers of cotton muslin. After a quick press to prepare the fabric, I traced the pattern onto the fabric and pinned 2 layers together, so that I could cut them out as one. I did this 2 times to get both sides of the bodice and could then sew all of them together. I directly sewed in the boning channels using the double layers of fabric and the seam allowances sewn to one side. After pressing everything in place to get all the seams set and the layer smooth, the structural layer of the bodice was done. Well, almost, because I added the lacing panels onto it as well. For this, I ironed some of the fabric I would also use for the lining layer later and reinforced it with some strong interfacing. I cut the lacing panels in place, sewed everything and then ironed it to get crisp edges on the top and bottom. I added steel boning into it and both panels could then be sewn onto the muslin bodice. Then I added all the missing boning into it. The last step was then to add the eyelets onto the back panels, and the reinforcement layer was actually done. Next up, I worked on the lining. This was done almost the same way as the layer before. I prepared the lining fabric by ironing it. I chose the light blue lining that would work well with the chiffon fabric. To give it a bit more stability, I ironed on a soft interfacing. Most linings tend to be a bit slippier, and adding a light layer of interfacing helps that the fabric won't shift as much when handled further. Now all the pattern pieces are drawn onto the lining fabric as well, and after adding the seam allowances, everything is cut out. Next up, I added my label onto the center front of the lining. And then all the panels are ready to be sewn together. I always like to sew 2 layers together, then iron the seam allowance in place, and then sew the next bigger panels together until everything is attached to each other. And this is how the lining looks on top of the reinforcing layer. So after these 2 layers were done, it's finally time for the outside of the bodice. Since the silk chiffon is see-through, I had to layer something underneath. I loved the look of it on top of the lining, and it matched the skirt best, so I went for this. First, I cut out all the layers from the lining fabric the same way as I did before. Then I got the silk chiffon out and layered it on top of it. I chose 2 layers of silk chiffon on each panel. To make sure nothing would move, I basted everything together with a big stitch on the sewing machine. Then I ironed it and trimmed the excess fabric, and each panel was done. The important thing to keep in mind here was to make the silk chiffon layer slightly bigger, so that when it curves around the body and the seams, the outer layer will have enough material to lay smoothly on the inner layers. After making sure everything was prepared carefully, I sewed all the bodice parts together for a 3rd time. After every seam, I pressed it carefully again and then added the next panel onto it. Before I could add everything together, I added a small piping at the bottom of the bodice. This was carefully pinned in place and then sewn to the bodice together with the reinforcement layer underneath. Since both layers were secured together, I could then add the lining layer right sides together on top of it and sew it to the other layers as well. Now the bottom half of the bodice is done and we can work on the sleeves and the Bertha. For this, I first made some bias tape to finish the armholes at the bottom. It was first sewn onto the outside and then finished on the inside by hand. I worked on the Bertha next. For this, I cut 2 layers for each side. One from the lining fabric, again reinforced with the thin interfacing layer. And for the outside, the lining fabric with 1 layer of the silk chiffon, reinforced with the thicker interfacing. This meant I had 8 pattern pieces that first all got the side seams closed and pressed. Then it was time to work on the neckline. Here I chose the rest of the middle tone tulle to make a subtle border. I cut it the right length I had measured before and then ironed it to create some layers. Those layers were then pinned in place and afterwards sewn onto the top of the lining pieces. Then I worked on the outside of the Bertha. This will be made from a bigger silk chiffon panel gathered at the top and tucked to the bodice at some places to create a cloud-like look. So after cutting the panel in the right shape, I sewed a gathering thread onto the top so that it could then be added to the previously prepared pattern pieces. Just like on the skirt, it got divided evenly, pinned in place, and then gathered by pulling the gathering thread. And then it got secured in place by sewing over it. As a last step, the previously prepared silk pieces were added onto it and ironed in place. And now the Bertha could be added to the bodice. While the outside seam was done by machine again, the whole inside was sewn together by hand after it got carefully pinned in place all around. The last pieces that had to be cut now were the sleeves. I traced the pattern on one layer of the silk for the outside and 2 layers of tulle for the inside, to give the whole sleeve an airy and transparent look. Where the top of the sleeve got finished with a French seam, the bottom was gathered and then sewn onto a strip of glass beads. Finally, I added the sleeves onto the bodice and sewed them together by hand. And now it was time to decorate the bodice. Since the design had some shooting stars on it, I had to create them now to add them to the bodice. Sadly, nothing I ordered for it arrived on time, so I had to improvise them with what I had on hand. I used some drop-shaped pearls and tried to fade the tail out by using white and clear glass beads for it. And then it was time to assemble the whole dress. First, all the skirt layers were sewn together and I could look at the dress on the mannequin for the first time. Sadly, it was a bit too small for the dress form, but I still really liked the look of it. And then lastly, I added the shooting stars onto the bodice. First, I pinned them in place to determine where I want them to go, and then I sewed them in place by hand. And here is the final dress. With over 100 hours of work and way over 100 meters of fabric, this is one of the biggest and most time-consuming projects I've ever worked on. But let's be honest, it's most certainly also one of the most ethereal and definitely made to be worn by a queen. So now you've seen the finished dress. Working on it was so much fun. I really loved the design, I really loved the shape of the dress and the inspiration for it. Also working with Astraea made a lot of fun, so this was a huge bonus as well. The only thing I underestimated hugely was the amount of time that would go into the dress. I knew it would be time consuming, working on the petticoat with the interchanging colors and working on the skirt with the beads on it, and also developing the pattern for the whole dress would take a lot of time. But in the end, I needed so much more. And to make this dress really perfect, I would have had to spend at least 100 hours more. In the end, this dress already took me over 100 hours. Not to mention how many fabric went into it. All in all, I think the dress is beautiful, and I think Astraea will look fantastic in it, which I'm really looking forward to see. And that's all that matters. In the end, it's like it is with every project, that it will teach you lessons and that you will learn from it. And I definitely learned a lot from this dress. I'm really grateful for this project, not only because it was fun to make, but also because it showed how creativity can bring you together. And that's something that I find very beautiful. So let's not ramble about it any longer. I hope you liked today's dress and video. If you did, feel free to like it, subscribe to my channel or leave a comment. It would mean a lot to me. And until next time. 123. Ich kann es nicht sagen. War das gut?
Ja.
Okay,